welcome you to the upper room, and we find ourselves today right in front of the painted rock, or the painted wall as they call it here in the Black Canyon of the Gunnison. We're not really far from our home, but this is a spectacular place to be. Now, how long we'll be here will depend on how much wind comes up, because wind tends to interfere with the sound, but as long as we can, we will be right here on this gorgeous fall day in western Colorado. You may see some snow behind me. We've had plenty of snow even though it is fall. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But for now, what you see behind me, that wall, is a 2,250 foot cliff, sheer cliff, that goes down to the bottom of the Gunnison River, the Black Canyon of the Gunnison River. Now the rock that makes up that painted wall is called basement rock. And geologists and scientists, of course, date that rock at somewhere around 1.7 billion years old. All right, and before we go any further, you know that I'm not a scientist, so I'll do my best to explain something that is going to become important eventually in this lesson. Now, the time, the expansive time of billions of years is really important to the evolutionist, because the theory is, and it's used as a magic wand, by the way, that over billions of years, anything could happen, of course. So let's suppose it has happened. So you got 1.7 billion years there. Now, you might see that in amongst the basement rock, what you'll see now are little ribbons of igneous rock that are sandwiched in between the basement rock. Now, I could go into that, but I'm not going to go into that, because what's really fascinating to me is that if you look at the top of the painted wall, you have that supposed 1.7 billion year rock, but on the top of it is a layer of Entrada sandstone. Now, that is dated at 130 million years. So the problem becomes, why is there nothing between 130 million years and 1.7 billion years? That's a problem. Nothing happened for well over a billion years. Now, we could do this all day long and talk about this. If you really want to get into this topic, I want to encourage you to watch the movie. If you haven't, I highly recommend Del Tackett's movie is Genesis History, where they take you all around the country, but especially they take you to the Grand Canyon, where they show you the layers that were laid down absolutely instantaneously, which screams cataclysmic flood, right? And so that's kind of the point. Why has not the sandstone over a billion years eroded at all? It's flat up there. There are no canyons, there are no riverbeds, there are no cracks in that sandstone, which over a billion years there really should be. And so it begs the question, and we could have the debate all day long, really, is the dating, the magic wand of time, applicable here, or is it possible there was a cataclysmic flood? The Institute for Creation Research talks about this very setting, and let me tell you what they say about it. They say these rocks show that the billion years never really happened. The Entrada sandstone exposed at Black Canyon provides strong evidence that the one-time judgment event described in Genesis solves the missing time mystery. The missing time. What happened to erosion for well over a billion years? Because that sandstone shouldn't look so flat and perfect on top, if in fact that was the truth about how that was formed. Now, again, this canyon supposedly was formed billions of years ago, but for the biblical creationist point of view that I carry, most of you probably carry as well, you know that a cataclysmic flood could make this happen much more rapidly. In 1926, a diversion ditch was dug with overflow water, a mass amount of volume flowing through it, and just outside of Walla Walla, Washington, in a matter of 6 days, It formed a canyon over 1,500 feet long and hundreds of feet deep in just 6 days. That canyon now is called the Burlingame Canyon outside of Walla Walla. And again, it begs the question, if that could be formed in 6 days without the breaking of the fountains from the underneath the earth, is it possible that canyons like this in the Grand Canyon could have formed in a similar time? Or at least we're talking months instead of billions of years? That becomes the question. Now, this lesson is not about science or geology. It's about the idea that many people, most people in our society, have assumed that when they're told things by the science community that it has to be true. What I want to show you is that much of what we hear from the science community comes with a bias, right? They start with a certain perspective. We sometimes call that a worldview. They have a certain worldview, and that worldview does not include the existence of God. And so it is that worldview that I want to say is a doctrine of atheistic evolution that is absolutely the rule of thumb in our society. You cannot question atheistic evolution as a doctrine that is taught in every school, in most museums, history museums. It is just assumed. But I want to pose the question, is it possible that human beings have a preconceived idea or worldview that actually is responsible for the data that they give us? The truth is, there are innumerable inconsistencies in the scientific data that they feed us, and I want to show that to you for a few more minutes. Richard Dawkins, who by any account is the foremost and most famous present-day atheist from Oxford University, he's a zoologist actually, he has stated unequivocally that there is no God, therefore there was no creation, except even Dawkins, in his book The Blind Watchmaker, says this: animals give the appearance of having been designed by a theoretically sophisticated and practically ingenious physicist or engineer. He can't deny the fact that the complexity of design that's present in all animals and in nature as well is hard to account for, but he stays with his bias no matter what, and that's what we're up against. That's what we understand is how the rules of the game are being played, that scientists, most scientists anyway, come into the argument or the debate about God, no God, with a bias that does not allow them to consider the possibility that what we see behind us has been designed, or it's a result of what God has chosen to do over thousands of years. So the key concept here that we want to latch on to is, what does the evidence point to? Really, could we look at evidence without a preconceived bias? Now, I want to go back even further in time than possibly the evidence of a flood, and I want to go back to the origin of life. This is a fascinating discussion. Is it possible that life was formed from non-life? It's called the spontaneous generation of non-life to life. Could that have happened? In fact, that has to have happened if there is no God. We have to assume that from nothing came something, and that something grew into something bigger, and here we are. So we go back to the point of origin. Was there no life and suddenly life appeared? Now, you know that there is not one example of that on this earth that we know of. A scientific word for that is abiogenesis. That is, that the beginning of life did not come from life. That's what the A in front of it is about. And I want to show you that literally 100+ years ago, this was set to rest. But before that, I want to go to a scientific website. That's what it's called. It's called Sciencing Website, and they say this about abiogenesis. Here we go. Abiogenesis happens rarely. It happened at least once about 3.5 billion years ago, and probably has not occurred since then. This is a scientific website. Can I ask you, does that sound like science? Can I read the words again that sound very unscientific? The words are rarely, at least, once, about, probably. They don't know, but we'll go with that assumption. 3.5 billion years ago, it must have happened because we can't prove it didn't. Again, the only way to come to that conclusion is to start with the premise there is no God, and we will not move off of that premise. And everything else will be shoved into that with billions of years as the possible reason why. And so what we hear from scientists is oftentimes, in this arena anyway, the age of the earth and of course the beginning of life, is trust us, we're scientists. We may not be able to prove anything, but you just need a little faith. Well, I gotta tell you, I don't have that much faith, do you? The mid to late 1800s is called the golden age of microbiology. And you probably recognize the name Louis Pasteur. He had a friend who worked with him named Robert Koch, and together they set out to prove once and for all that non-life cannot spawn life. And they did an experiment. In fact, this debate was going on because the idea of spontaneous generation of non-life to life had been around for a long time, and Pasteur, quite honestly, probably Koch as well, just got fed up with it. And France actually offered a reward to anyone, or an award to anyone, who could prove otherwise. And so they set out to do that. And in fact, Louis Pasteur, through what he called his swan neck flask, and I can't get into all the details, proved once and for all that non-life cannot produce life. And so when he stood before literally thousands of other scientists, he spoke this way about his experiment. I have taken my drop of water from the immensity of creation, and I have taken it full of the elements appropriate to the development of microscopic organisms, and I wait, I watch, I question. Never will the doctrine of spontaneous generation recover from the mortal blow of this simple experiment. It's all over, he says, and France agreed. They gave him the award for proving it's never happened, it never could happen. Now in the 1950s, a couple scientists in Chicago came up with some chemicals that they said with a flash of lightning, with some electricity, could produce something, but nothing has come of that actually. I was taught that. One of the guys' name was Miller. I was taught that in school. You were taught that in school. And the assumption was, oh, from there they went on to prove that, yeah, non-life produces life. They've never proven that. That ball never got moved down the field. It's embarrassing to them. But nobody questions that again, because again, in every single school, other than maybe some private schools, it is not questioned that non-life spawned life. And now the answer that is given by many scientists about this idea is simply this: an act of spontaneous generation must have happened. Does that sound like science? Isn't science something you can prove in a laboratory? No, we have a preconceived idea. We have a bias. And so everything must fit into that bias is their approach. Again, we can call this a worldview, right? An atheistic evolutionary worldview. We could also call it fixed conclusions or bias, but the conclusion is we will fit everything into our bias, and from that point on, you can't question it because we have white lab coats. We're scientists. I want to call that willful ignorance, because when presented with things that they can't fit into their worldview, they are willfully ignorant. They say, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to investigate that. That doesn't fit my preconceived idea. Now, Many, many years ago, Sir Isaac Newton put it this way: atheism is so senseless. When I look at the solar system, I see the Earth at the right distance from the sun to receive the proper amounts of heat and light. This did not happen by chance. The true God is a living, intelligent, and powerful being. Okay. Even, however, Sir Isaac Newton went on, when asked about Jesus Christ, to say that Jesus is God is idolatry. He could not accept that reality. So that brings us finally into our passage for today. And this passage is all about evidence. Evidence. And that's from the lips of Jesus. And in the face of evidence, once again, he is confronted by Jewish leaders who have a bias, a preconceived idea about the way things are, and there's nothing Jesus can say or do to change their preconceived bias. Much like Isaac Newton had a preconceived bias about who Jesus was. Good teacher, a moral man, certainly someone who shared a lot of wisdom, but God? No, we can't have that. Okay, all of that to say that much like the scientists today that refuse to look at real data, things like clams on top of 26,000-foot Mount Everest. How did clams get up there? And when you read about it, they say, well, we've debunked the flood, so it couldn't have been a flood. So, in spite of the preconceived fixation on a worldview, Jesus now interacts once again with these Jewish leaders in John chapter 10. And so in this series we're calling The Expression, and the book of John actually is not a biography of Jesus in the sense that every day of his life is recorded, or even every week of his life. John's point is, I will share enough of Jesus' life to show you, without a doubt, that Jesus is God, that Jesus claimed to be deity, and the question then becomes, is there any evidence to back that up? Again, most people in our world today would say, well, Jesus was certainly a good moral person and a great teacher and one of the great people of all time. But God? So this series is about covering John chapters 1 through 12. We've already done the upper room in the beginning of this ministry, but consistently in John 1 through 12, Jesus claims to be divine, to be God, and it causes quite a stir, as you can imagine. Steve, are you sure he claimed that? Let me take you to John 12:44. Jesus shouted to the crowds, if you trust me, you are trusting not only me, but also God who sent me. For when you see me, you are seeing the one who sent me. When you look at me, you are seeing God in a bodily form, is what he claims. Now he has to be a liar, a lunatic, crazy, the mayor of Crazy Town, or he has to be the Lord that he claims to be. Now, as I said, the book of John is not a day-by-day blow of the life of Jesus. I take you to John chapter 21, verse 25. Jesus also did many other things, John writes. If they were all written down, I suppose the whole world could not contain the books that would be written. John hit these high points, but the theme undoubtedly is he is saying, I was with him, he claimed to be deity. And so today's passage will take us into, is there any evidence of this at all? Before we get there, John chapter 20, verse 30, the disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book. These are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. What we did right, I mean, it's just a fraction of what we experienced, but what we did right proves he is the Messiah, the Son of God. And so we're back into John 10, and I gotta tell you, I have not said this to you, but this is a remarkable moment in Jesus' life because it is the last day of his public ministry. And I know that sounds crazy because We're not even halfway through the book of John. But the rest of the book of John starts 3 months from this moment where he's raising Lazarus from the dead, and then the Passion Week. And the rest of the book of John is about that last week and a few more days. The first half of John is his whole life up until this moment. This is a really important time that you understand what's at stake here. Now what we're going to see is that Jesus, after teaching in the temple about sheep, right, and him being the shepherd and talking through that whole thing that we read through and studied through, he then left for 2 months. He has returned to Jerusalem 2 months later. This is the first time he's back, the first day he's back, and the Jewish leaders see him and pounce on him. And we pick it up in John chapter 10, verse 22. And what I want to show you in the passage that remains, and it's a lengthy passage, so we'll break this into 2 lessons. I want to show you what I'm going to call 5 movements, okay, in this last day play that goes on. It's not a play, it's real life. We'll cover the first 2 movements in this lesson, and then the last 3 in the next lesson. This first movement I want to call premeditated pretense. Let's start in verse 22, and we won't go far before we stop and unpack. Here we go. It was now winter. You got to stop there. It appears to be winter here, right? You see the snow. It's fall. We just had a blast of winter come through, but it wasn't quite winter. This is really interesting what John says. It was winter. He's talking about the fact that now we are just about 3 months from the crucifixion of Jesus. It's winter. It's November, December of the year in our calendar before the spring where he'll be crucified. But it's not just physically winter. This appears to be winter. It's not really winter. It was winter by the calendar in Jerusalem, but it was winter in the lives of the people of Israel. They were in the midst of rejecting the very Son of God. It was a dark time for them. It was cold in the souls of the people who decided this could not be the long-awaited Messiah from way back in Genesis that was predicted to come. And so it was winter. Make sure you get that part. It reminds me of what C.S. Lewis wrote in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when he said, "Wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death. And when he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again." Aren't those great lines? That's where we're at. He's about to shake his mane, and it'll be spring before you know it. Winter will die. This idea that Jesus could not be the Son of God, that idea will have to die in the minds and hearts of the people who knew him. And so we go on in verse 22. Again, it was now winter, and Jesus was in Jerusalem at the time of Hanukkah, the festival of dedication. Okay, we got to stop there. The festival of dedication, what we now call Hanukkah, it was also called the Festival of Lights because people would light candles all throughout their house. And in doing so, they were celebrating an incredible event in their history. Now, you might flip back through the Old Testament and say, I don't see Hanukkah. I don't see the Festival of Lights, the Festival of Dedication. You don't, because it took place in the 400 years from the time of the last prophet until we see John the Baptist arrive on the scene, okay, and then Jesus. In that time, that was a dark time. They had walked away from God. There was a Syrian king by the name of Antiochus, and he had given himself the name Epiphanes, which means God manifest. In other words, I'm God. His detractors, especially his Jewish detractors, they changed one letter in that title to Epimanes, which means madman, which was a more accurate description of this Syrian king. Okay, this king is sold out to the Greek religions and the Greek thinking of his day. He comes into Jerusalem, conquers Jerusalem in 170 BC, And he so hates the Jewish people. In fact, he's the first king to actually persecute them because of their faith. And he comes in and takes Jerusalem, takes the temple, goes into the temple, into the Holy of Holies, and sacrifices a pig to make his point. From that moment on, the Jewish people could no longer have their scriptures. If he found that you had your Old Testament scriptures with you, he'd put you to death. If you were teaching your kids about the Old Testament scriptures, you could be put to death. This was a dark, cold, terrible time in the history of the Jewish people. Again, about 170 BC. Now, there was a priest in the next 7 years who had some sons. And one of his sons, who was also a priest, his name was Judas Maccabeus. Have you heard of the Maccabeans? Well, in the intertestamental times, the Maccabeans became famous because Judas Maccabeus was a warrior, not just a priest. And he led a revolt. And it was by about 163, 164 BC that they took Jerusalem back. Did you know that's where Hanukkah came from? It is the victory celebration of Jerusalem being brought back to the Jewish people. Interestingly, it was taken by that Syrian king. By the way, you can tell that Syria, the people around Israel, have hated Israel for a long time, right? Now, it still happens. Now that king took Jerusalem on what is December 25th of the month Kislev, which is either November or December. Judas Maccabeus retakes Jerusalem on December 25th of the month of Kislev 7 years later. Pretty remarkable. That's the celebration. It's not found in the Old Testament. That's Hanukkah. Okay, all that background to tell you this is the setting. He's been gone 2 months. Let's pick it up in verse 23. Jesus was in the temple walking through the section known as Solomon's Colonnade. What is that about? In 586, when Babylon came in and destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, they left one wall up. And that was there still in Jesus' day. They put a porch over it. They put a roof over the top. So in Jesus' time, people in the winter especially would congregate underneath that roof next to that wall that was still standing from 586 BC, from the old Solomon Grand Temple. And that's where people hung out in the winter. So that's where Jesus finds himself. Verse 24, the people surrounded him. Now when we say people, you're about to find out the Jewish leaders see him 2 months later, and they immediately pounce on him and they say this: "How long are you going to keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly." So this question seems innocent enough. A good question, I guess. Well, it depends on the motives, right? We know the motives of these Jewish leaders. This question is a ruse. It's based on sarcasm and corruption. As far as we know, up until this time, they have attempted to kill him 7 or 8 times. This is a setup. They want him to say one more time, plainly for all to hear, that he is the Messiah, that he is the Son of God, because that forms a basis for their bias that he is a blasphemer. Claiming to be the Son of God surely means he's a blasphemer. They can now stone him, and all the people that hear it can attest to, yes, that's what's supposed to happen to a blasphemer, okay? This is huge. They hate him. They have never had an enemy like Jesus. They detest him to their core. As I said, in John 1 through 12, every chapter has some kind of a confrontation between Jesus and these corrupt haters of Jesus who want to kill him. So let's fast forward up to John 19, verse 7. The Jewish leaders replied to what Jesus said in John 19 by saying, "By our law, he ought to die because he calls himself the Son of God." That's why I call that little section, and it's not much, is it? Premeditated pretense. They have been waiting in the shadows for him to appear again. And the pretense is the question. They have a motive before they even ask it, and the motive involves murdering the Son of God. Let's move on now to the second movement. Again, we'll close this lesson out with this second movement. I hope and pray You're getting a real taste for what Jesus is up against and how this thing is heating up immensely. And you know that it'll come to a head here in 3 months. Performance is proof, is what we see now. Jesus responds in verse 25, I have already told you. He says, I have nothing new to say. This will not be different. You're just wanting me to say it out loud, and I will say it out loud. He says, I have already told you, and you don't believe me. There's that word pistuo or pistos, which means you don't place your confidence, you don't rely on me, you don't trust me. You don't believe me. Now watch this. He says the proof, or evidence, the proof is in the work I do in my Father's name. That's the proof. So our first and only discussion question of the day, what is the work that Jesus did? How is that evidence of what he claims? Now there's no doubt here that his enemies cannot deny the fact that the lame now walk, the deaf now hear, the blind now see, the lepers are now healed, and yes, even the dead have been raised. They can't deny that. Since they can't deny that, now they're going to ascribe to him evil motives, evil spirits, and we'll get into that. But again, this idea of them not believing, them not trusting him to be who he claims to be, is all throughout the book of John. John is about believing. Let me give you some evidence to that fact. In John 3:16, of course, for this is how God loved the world. He gave his one and only Son, so that everyone who believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. God sent his Son into the world not to judge the world, but to save the world through him. If the world will believe in him, is the inference. Jumping to verse 18 of John 3, there is no judgment against anyone who believes in him. But anyone who does not believe in him, he's talking about himself in the third person now, has already been judged for not believing in God's one and only Son. And the judgment is based on this fact. God's light came into the world, but people loved the darkness. If you're asking the question why people don't believe, and we know they don't oftentimes, he just states the answer. Because they love the darkness. He says they love the darkness more than they love the light. Their actions are evil. All who do evil hate the light and refuse to go near it for fear their sins will be exposed. But those who do what is right come to the light so that others can see that they are doing what God wants. Why do people not believe? Because we love our sin. We are so entrenched in it. Like we said with the scientist, we have this worldview, and all the data has to fit into that, and if it doesn't, we'll just ignore the data. The data for those concerning the Son of God is there's a preconceived bias that Jesus could not be the Son of God, and my bias and my worldview is I enjoy my sin, and he will expose my sin. So that's why when we talk about loving the world, if we want to truly be like Jesus, we will not affirm the evil in which people live. We will not accept that and say, that's okay, it doesn't matter. It mattered to Jesus. Now let's go back to John chapter 7, verse 7. The world can't hate you, but it does hate me because I accuse it of doing evil. The world will hate us if we are like Jesus, because we say, that's evil. That's just plain evil, right? I mean, mutilating children, murdering children in the womb, that's just evil. Now to say, oh, in love, I accept whatever you want, that's to be unlike Jesus. Jump down to verse 17 of chapter 7. Anyone who wants to do the will of God will know whether my teaching is from God or merely my own. Now remember, the bias, the worldview, the preconceived fixation of the Jewish leaders is that Jesus is not, cannot possibly be the Son of God. Therefore, yes, he does miraculous things, but those miraculous things will be explained by billions of years. No, his miraculous actions we explained by the fact that they come from Satan. Remember them saying, he has a demon, you have a demon? That's why they said that. We cannot quibble with what you do. It's miraculous, it's crazy, wild, amazing, but it comes from the devil. Now don't miss this. Jesus was never afraid to offend them for speaking the lies they spoke, for living the evil they lived. And here 2,000 years later, we have accepted a gospel, a supposed following of the same Jesus, by saying, don't offend anyone. That's not loving. Well, to say that's not loving is to say Jesus himself was not loving. He maintained truth no matter what. If some were offended, if some hated him, oh well. We do not have the right to change the gospel that Jesus laid down. If we see evil, we must call it out. If people say, well, that's unloving, we must understand that their version of love is not from Jesus at all. Writer and Bible teacher John MacArthur puts it this way: it is the love of sin and the hatred of righteousness that produces unbelief even when all the evidence is there. And that's what we're talking about. The evidence that Jesus did things that only the Father could do through him, only the Creator, the God of the universe could do through a man on this earth. The evidence was there. The Jewish leaders couldn't even deny that what he did was spectacular. Remember, Nicodemus told him that in John 3. We know you must be from God. Nobody could do these things. And yet they decided, because of their bias, their preconceived notions of reality, he can't be the Son of God. And so we'll explain it away. As we wrap this lesson up, before we get into the other 3 points in this incredible text, I want to circle back to Louis Pasteur. He lived in the mid to late 19th century. He by no means had an easy life. Illness had harmed his sister, caused her to live a life of a handicapped person her entire life. Louis Pasteur himself, he and his wife, lost 3 children because of illness, which prompted him to dive deep into microbiology and to resolve issues that to this very day, millions of us prosper from his scientific research and discoveries. An amazing man. Not only did Pasteur prove that non-life cannot generate life, he also proved that there are germs, there is bacteria everywhere, and the interconnectivity of bacteria in our lives causes illness, and he solved a lot of the issues that humanity had and still has to this day. Now, is that all isolated from any kind of faith? Not at all. His grandson said this about Louis Pasteur: he had absolute faith in God and in eternity, and a conviction that the power for good given to us in this world would be continued beyond it. What we do here that is of God will continue on, he says. And they were feelings which pervaded his whole life. The virtues of the gospel had ever been present to him. Pasteur went to present his evidence, his scientific evidence that non-life cannot beget life. His scientific friends told him not to do it, that he'll be castigated, he'll be thrown out of their society, out of their scientific circles, and he did not care. So God used a man who understood truth, who God gave insights to, that would affect in a positive way millions of people. Now I want to end with this passage before we get on to the next lesson. Colossians 1:15. Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. He existed before anything was created and is supreme over all creation. For through him God created everything in the heavenly realms and on earth. He made the things we can see and the things we can't see, such as thrones and kingdoms and rulers and authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through him and for him. He existed before anything else, and he holds all creation together. Paul is saying he is God. He is great, and he is good. And that did not sit well with the Jewish leaders. Thanks for joining us for this lesson, and we'll try to do the next lesson right here in this spot because it's really a remarkable place. We love you, enjoy doing this journey with you, and I pray that this is encouraging to you. God bless you guys.